Hi, I'm Beverly Harzog, host of Your Personal Economy. You can't control what goes on in the world in terms of inflation or even the price of groceries, but you can control your own personal economy. And I'm going to show you how to do that because the way you spend your money is the way you spend your life. And I want you to have the best life possible. Welcome to episode number 5. I am very excited today to have as my guest Charlotte Coles. She's the personal finance advice columnist for The Cut and also a freelance journalist. And I recently read a column of Charlotte's in The Cut, and I was just flabbergasted by this story. It is an incredible story, and everyone needs to hear this story. We recently had National Consumer Protection Week, and so I kind of wanted to just piggyback onto that and give you some information to help you avoid fraudulent situations and scams like what Charlotte had to endure. So, welcome, Charlotte, to Your Personal Economy.
Thank you so much for having me, Beverly.
Absolutely. You've interviewed me a couple of times, and now it's my honor to interview you. And I watched your interview on CNN. I read your column about this, and this is an incredible story. It started out with just a seemingly innocent phone call from Amazon, isn't that right? And they asked you about some purchases that they thought that you had made. So, can you give us just kind of an overview of what you went through? And as I understand it, this whole ordeal lasted about 5 hours on the phone.
Yeah, it was over 5 hours. It started off with a pretty routine seeming phone call from someone who said that they were from Amazon customer service. This call is being recorded for quality assurances. Everything seemed like very normal. We've all gotten those phone calls, I think, before. And Amazon does, in fact, make those phone calls, or at least they did at the time. And they had flagged some purchases that looked suspicious on my account. And I, was grateful to them for doing so. And they said they would keep those purchases from going through. And I had heard that there had been, I'd seen some headlines about scams happening through Amazon. And the woman on the phone said that they had been dealing with these issues and trying to crack down on them. And so they were working directly with the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, on these cases. And they had a liaison there and asked if I would be willing to talk to him. And, it seemed a little weird, but I have no experience with this. So I said, okay. And so she patched me through to this man who told me that my identity had been stolen and actually used in a much larger, and was part of a much larger international criminal investigation that they had been looking at for a while. What he also said that really caught my attention and really scared me was that he knew a lot of personal information about me and my family. So he had the last 4 digits of my social security number. He knew my address. He knew the names of my family members, including my husband and 2-year-old son. He knew my extended family, my parents' names, and he told me that we were probably being watched and that my phone call, my laptop had potentially been hacked and was I was under surveillance of some kind. It all just seemed so outrageous, but also terrifying. And when someone has that kind of personal information about you, you listen.
Absolutely. And, they mentioned your son, and, I'm a mom.
Yeah,
And if somebody mentions my kid and I feel like this is threatening, I'm really going to pay attention.
for sure.
I mean,
I mean, the risks of trying to call someone's bluff suddenly become
mhm,
much higher. And
absolutely.
so things sort of unfolded from there. The actual request for money, which was never really framed as a request or a demand, but
Mhm,
it came much later, over 5 hours later, and it was sort of couched within the general framework of they were helping me sort out this identity theft and this investigation. It was framed within them helping me secure my identity as being separate
mhm.
from the identity that had been stolen and was using to perpetrate these crimes. And so that unfolded very gradually. They didn't just come out of the gate and ask for a bunch of money. I didn't even that took, that was like many, 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 many steps down the road. So it was very nuanced and very, looking back, tons of things that really made that hair stand up on the back of my head. But also I was just so afraid that I didn't know what else to do.
I can't imagine how terrifying that must have been. On your CNN interview, you mentioned a technique called blocking the exits. And I thought this was really fascinating because this was such a sophisticated scam. So can you explain what's meant by blocking the exit? It's kind of isolating you, right?
Exactly. That's exactly what it is. And it's textbook not only in scams, but just as a manipulation tactic. If you're trying to coerce someone,
Mhm,
then what you really want to do is make them feel like they have nowhere else to turn. So in my case, they were very authoritative and explicit that I was not to tell anyone what was going on. And this was a government matter, and that I couldn't tell my husband, I couldn't tell anyone else. And if I told them, then they would be considered sort of co-conspirators almost, since I was technically under investigation for all of the things that my supposed identity thieves had been doing under my
mhm.
name. So the more I involved anyone else, the more they would get sort of ensnared in this investigation, which again, in retrospect, sounds totally ridiculous. And even in the moment, I was like, this is ridiculous. But I also, when you're in this position of being gradually removed farther and farther from the reality that and the sort of gut
Mhm.
checks that you have, and your intuition that tells you what is normal and what is not, and that is all being replaced by this very threatening, very authoritative group of people. It was more than one. They were sort of like passing the phone back and forth. Then it's enough to make you question yourself.
Oh, absolutely. I just can't imagine what that must have been like. And for being on the phone for so long, it must have just worn you down mentally as well. And I guess that's one of the tactics. I mean, I watch a lot of forensic files,
Yeah.
and I've seen interrogation tactics like that, where they just try to wear the person down until they just confess, to make it all stop. And I imagine the technique is kind of similar. You just get so tired, you're going to do what you have to do to get, just to fix the situation.
That's exactly right. Yeah. Yeah. I actually interviewed a psychologist who studies coercion, and
Mhm.
particularly coerced confessions. He's a professor, and he's written a book on this topic. And he works for the John Jay College of Criminal Justice. And he said that there were striking similarities between what had happened to me and what the people who the scammers,
Mhm.
the techniques that they had deployed, and what happens in manipulated and coerced confessions. It's the really long isolated period where people just step by step kind of walk you into this place
Mhm.
where you just become so desperate to get out of it that you will do the
Mhm.
unthinkable.
Yeah, that's just, so sophisticated. It just and so coordinated among people. Now, by the time they asked you for $50,000, correct?
Well, they told me that I needed to take cash out of the bank in order, because all of my assets would be frozen, because as part of the investigation. So they said, if you're going to need cash to live off of while all of your
Mhm,
assets are frozen. And I have an emergency fund, which, I built up over many years,
mhm.
that had a little bit more than $50,000 in it that I keep for emergencies. I'm a freelancer, so I have to save. My taxes are not automatically withheld from my paycheck, so I have to save money
Mhm.
for my taxes as well. So part of it was that too. And so I went to the bank and withdrew almost the whole I took out $50,000, which was almost the entire contents of my savings, and brought it home with me, thinking that this was the money that I was going to need to live off of, because while the investigation so
Mhm.
investigation continued. They did not tell me that I was going to be giving that money to them until
Okay.
later. But the man I was on the phone with said that one of his associates was coming to my apartment, and
Mhm.
that was
Mhm.
obviously terrifying. My son was there,
Mhm.
and before the man arrived, he told me to package up the cash in a box and label it with a locker number and my case ID and a number of other pieces of information about myself. And he said that they would secure it on a government site. And then because they also said that I was going to need a new social security number. So I mean, again, every time I recount this, it sounds totally absurd. But in the moment, the whole day had just seemed so crazy, and I was so
Mhm.
out of my depth and really didn't feel like I had anywhere else. I kept asking, like, can't I just like go to someone's office and like sort this out in
Mhm.
person? Like, why do I have to do this with you over the phone? Like, this seems really unprofessional on your part. And he had an answer for everything, and even if it
Mhm.
didn't entirely make sense, he very much would sort of just like plow ahead. And whenever I was asking too many questions, he would just like snow me with more information and threats. Continued to bring up my son and how, if I didn't want to be arrested, then this was protocol that I needed to follow. And so again, the entire time there were a million red flags, and my intuition was screaming at me, but at the same time I really
Mhm.
didn't feel like I had any other good options. Of course, in retrospect, I should have just hung up the phone, but at the time he told me that if I did that I would be arrested. So
So, Charlotte, after that amount of time on the phone, I can just imagine that even if you saw the red flags, you were probably, too frightened to stop and really think about it, nor were you given time to think about it. I mean, it sounds like whenever you ask questions, and you're a very good journalist, so I'm sure you asked a lot of questions. It seems like they just tried to move you on past that question to something that was just even more frightening.
Mhm.
Did you feel like you were talking to the CIA at that point?
It's interesting. They identified themselves as being members of the CIA, which I even was confused about because the CIA is, you know, typically operates internationally. So I was like,
Mhm.
why are they coming after me? And they explained that it was because it was a case of international money laundering and drug smuggling.
Ah,
So
okay.
even though, but like, and so I was like, this seems weird. I'm pretty sure that they gather intelligence overseas, but like, who am I to know? I'm not a member of the CIA. So, and I
Exactly.
didn't have time to really kind of like check it.
Mhm.
Normally under any other circumstances, I would have stopped and
Mhm.
researched, but I wasn't, I didn't have the time to do that.
Online on social media, you got a lot of pushback on this,
Mm.
and I think you're incredibly brave to come forward with this. And I also think that anybody who says, "Oh, this could never happen to me," isn't being realistic. I think this could happen to anyone. I don't care how sophisticated you are, where you live. This is the kind of thing where you have no idea how you're going to react until you're in this exact situation. One of the things that was brought up was people were wondering why the bank didn't ask you questions when you took out this money. Did they ask you any questions at all?
No, no, they didn't. But they did give me a sheet of paper that was cautioning me about scams, and I did look at it, but none of them at that
Mm.
point I hadn't been asked for the money or told to give it to anyone. So
Uh-huh.
I still
Okay.
it didn't seem to apply. Like all of the things listed didn't seem to apply. And
Right. Right.
I also, just to address what you were saying earlier about how people think that this can't happen to them, I also thought this would never happen to me. But I think what is more important is that this particular scam, I'm sure, would not happen to many people. I'm sure there are many, many people, and I know that there are many people who even had this scam, you know, someone tried to pull off this exact same scam with them. They got the Amazon call or they got something like that. And similar threats, could have even been the same people, and they didn't fall for it. And what the data and the research shows is there's actually been some really great studies on the difference between people who are targeted and lose money and the difference between people who are targeted and do not lose money. And one of the there are a couple of key findings there. One of them is that people are less likely to lose money if they have heard of this type of scam happening before. So even just by sharing this story, it is preventative. So when people hear this, they are much less likely to have it happen to them. So of course, when you read about it, you're like, oh, that would never happen to me. But actually, now it is much less likely to happen to you because you read about it.
Exactly. Yes.
So I think, but then the other thing that I also think is important to note is that there are different types of scams that are effective on different types of people. And this was one very specific type of scam that happened to be very effective on me. But there is a whole world of different scams out there that would be very unlikely to work on me, like a romance scam. Like I am very happily married. I probably would not fall for a texting romance scam, but there are a lot of people who would, and there are a lot of people who do. There are also just one of the, I think it was the most common type of scam last year was investment scams, where someone dangled this like shiny carrot of this great investment opportunity, and millions of people fell for it. And I would be less likely to fall for that because I don't invest my money in that way. I hope people extrapolate from my story is not that what happened to me could happen to anyone, but that there is a type of scam out there that anyone is more vulnerable to. And this one happened to be the one that I was vulnerable to. It probably is not going to be the one that is, going to work on you, especially if you've now read about it. But there are others that you could be more vulnerable to. And so these scammers are very sophisticated and everyone needs to be vigilant.
Yeah, that is such a great point, that different scams might work on different types of people. And, maybe you were vulnerable to this one because they had your family member names, they mentioned your son, and he was right in the next room.
Not the whole day. He was at school for most of it, but he came home at the end of the day, and they could hear him in the next room.
Yes. Wow. Well, thank you so much for sharing all this, because, people do hear about things like this. It does raise their radar. I sent your column to my adult children because I think it's such a, great information to read about, just so you know what's possible out there, what can happen. And I think you also mentioned in your column that, different age groups are more susceptible. We usually think that the elderly is the most susceptible, but it's actually not, is it?
No, and there's sort of intricacies within that data, but people under 60 are actually more likely to be scammed than people over 60. But they are vulnerable to different types of scams. So older people actually do tend to lose more money when they are scammed, but younger people are actually more susceptible, more likely to be scammed, just purely from a numbers perspective.
Yeah, and I think maybe life experience might have something to do with it as well. The older you get, the more things you've seen. But I
Yeah.
think that, you've done a great service for everyone by sharing your story.
Well,
Is there some point in that phone call, now that you can think back on, exactly what happened, how it unfolded? It was so intricate too, just piece by piece, like an onion. They just kind of layered this in there. Is there a point where you wish you had said, and like we said, hindsight's 2020, maybe I should just hang up, or maybe I should tell my husband, or maybe I should, check this out online, or, anything like that, any kind of advice that you could tell someone else that might be in the middle of a phone call like this, maybe what to look for?
Yes, absolutely. Um, I mean, all of this is sort of regular advice that you see about scams, which is like people will never ask for cash or gift cards or,
Mhm.
Bitcoin or whatever. No one will threaten arrest if you don't cooperate. And I think that people know that I think that people know that, they read that, but it is really hard to actually put that into practice when your family is being threatened. So,
Mhm.
so I think that one of the best things that you can do, and what I really wish I had done, was just find a way to get in touch with someone that I trusted, whether it was my husband or, my best friend is a lawyer, my brother's a lawyer. Um, I could have just reached out to someone. Again, I was terrified because they told me that I was under surveillance. So it would have been tricky to do that. But even to just
Mhm.
hang up and find a way to get in touch with someone else just for a gut check, that would have really, I think, been you know, that would have made all the difference. And
Mhm.
when I've spoken to other people who investigate fraud or, study it and study what makes it really effective, usually what helps prevent someone from becoming a victim rather than just a target is if
Mhm.
someone else intervenes or they talk to someone else and
Mhm.
they're like, that's a scam. So, really, just having someone that you can think of who you can trust, who will be that
Mhm.
gut check for you when you have been, you're from like a neuroscience perspective, when you are in fight or flight, it's very, very difficult to exercise judgment and behave rationally. So I think a lot of people love to think that they would behave rationally in a situation like this, and it's just not always the case, unfortunately. I mean, which is supported
Right.
by billions of dollars
Mhm.
worth of fraudulent losses every year. So, um,
Mhm.
unfortunately, it's just very common.
Yes, and, that's why I say, I never judge anyone when they have a story like this. I've made a lot of personal finance mistakes when I was young. So, I don't ever judge anybody for mistakes that they make or for getting caught up in something like this when it clearly was so sophisticated and so intense, and we talked earlier about blocking the exits, making you feel isolated, and, that, you could have thought, "Oh, well, maybe that's a red flag," but in the middle of that, I'm sure it's hard to think, really clearly and
Yep.
slowly and to sort of think logically while you're in the middle of all that.
Mhm, mhm.
Do you think you'll be able to get the $50,000 back, or is
No.
it no,
Unfortunately,
you don't
no.
think so?
No, I
Oh,
mean,
I'm sorry.
yeah. I mean, it seems very likely that these people were operating overseas,
Mhm.
and it was cash, so it wasn't insured in any way.
Yeah, yeah, that's too bad, but, anyway, you're doing a great thing by talking about this and making people aware, so thank you so much for coming on Your Personal Economy and talking to us about this.
Thank you for having me.
I really appreciate it.
Thank
Is there anything else you would like to add?
you. I think the final piece is that this is more common than anybody knows or seems
Mhm,
to fully grasp. Um, and since this piece has come out, I've received hundreds, if not thousands, of emails from other people who have had something similar happen to them. Um,
mhm,
and it's devastating. I mean, I know how devastating it is.
mhm,
Um, but and the sense of shame that you could be fooled and taken advantage of in this way. Um, and especially if you think that you are in an act of trying to protect the people closest to you and you wound up
mhm,
actually jeopardizing them in some ways by falling for this scam. um it can really take a deep, deep toll on people mentally, especially
mhm,
when people feel like they're just too ashamed to tell anyone, and there's this deep social stigma against people who fall for things like this. um
mhm,
and so I think one other thing that I really hope more people understand is that this is extremely common. And if it happens to someone um, be supportive. They really need support. A lot of people who are scammed go through deep mental health issues afterwards.
Mhm.
And it can be just a catastrophic financially, but also
Mhm.
psychologically. And so to be supportive and kind to people who go through this and experience it.
Mhm. Well, thank you. And, you have such courage to come out and talk about this, and that in itself helps to decrease the stigma. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining me for episode number 5, Anatomy of a $50,000 Amazon Scam. I want to thank Charlotte Coles for sharing her story. The more times you hear a story like this, the more likely you are to be able to spot the signs should you ever get a phone call like this. And Charlotte Coles gives regular personal finance advice on thecut.com. So check that out. She's a great writer and gives excellent advice. All right. I also want you to take just a couple of steps to protect yourself from fraud. Check your bank accounts and credit card accounts online regularly to look for fraudulent purchases. And check out your credit reports now and then at annualcreditreport.com. All right. It's free. You can look at your credit reports and look for any accounts you didn't open in your name. And that would be identity theft. And you want to report that as quickly as you can. All right, coming up next, episode number 6, your debt escape plan. I'm going to share with you how I got out of debt many years ago, and I'm going to show you how you can create your very own unique debt escape plan to get rid of that credit card debt. All right, see you then.